Hello, and welcome to Read Us a Story. What shall we read today? How about Mr Tickle by Roger Hargreaves. Mr Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream, because it made him laugh out loud, and that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinary long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Mr. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? He reached out one of his extraordinarily long arms, opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened the biscuit tin, took out a biscuit, brought it back upstairs, in through the bedroom door, and back to Mr. Tickle in bed. As you can see, it's very useful indeed having arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle munched his biscuit. He looked out of the window. "Today looks very much like a tickling day," he thought to himself. So, later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off through the wood. As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinarily long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeped in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks, and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle waited a minute and then reached in through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned round very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned a mischievous grin. He waited another minute and then tickled the teacher again. This time he kept on tickling until soon the teacher was laughing out loud and saying, "Stop it! Stop it!" over and over again. All the children were laughing too at such a funny sight. There was terrible pandemonium. Eventually, Mr. Tickle thought that he had had enough fun, so he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and then very quietly brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about, which of course he couldn't. Then Mr. Tickle went to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had. He tickled the policeman on traffic duty at the crossroads in the middle of town. It caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled the greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly in his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backwards and the apples rolled all over the shop. At the railway station, the guard was about to wave his flag for the train to leave, and as he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him until the train was 10 minutes late leaving the stations, and all the passengers were furious. That day, Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. He even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters in a puddle. Then Mr. Tickle went home, Sitting in his armchair in his small house at the other side of the wood, he laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he had tickled. So, if you are in any way ticklish, beware of Mr. Tickle and those extraordinarily long arms of his. Just think, perhaps he's somewhere about at this very moment while you're reading this book. Perhaps that extraordinarily long arms of his is already creeping up to the door of your room. Perhaps it's opening the door now and coming into the room. Perhaps, before you know what is happening, you will be well and truly tickled. And that was Mr. Tickle by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became, and the more hungry he became, the more he ate, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of a house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry, as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, 4 slices. Butter, 1 dish. Marmalade, 1 pot. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought, "That was a delicious breakfast," he thought to himself. "Now, I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch." He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. "That's funny," he thought. "I don't remember seeing that there before." Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. coming from somewhere up on top of that gigantic table was the most delicious, foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then decided that he must get up onto that table, so he began to climb the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult, and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages, the size of pillows. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes the size of beach balls. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and, being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand, and looking into the eyes of a real, live giant. "And who," thundered the giant, "are you?" Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his name. "Mr. Greedy," he squeaked. The giant laughed a laugh as loud as thunder. "Ha ha ha! Greedy by name and greedy by nature," he bellowed. "Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson." And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute. "Now," said the giant, in a much quieter voice, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" "Oh, yes," moaned Mr. Greedy, "I promise." "Very well," said the giant. "Then I'll let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. And you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to anymore. Now he looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better. Don't you? So, if you know anybody who is as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Beware of giants. And that was Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, there is a country called Happyland. As you might very well expect, everybody who lives in Happyland is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happyland. And, as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happyland are happy too. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat or a dog or even a worm go to Happyland. This is a story about someone who lived there who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happyland. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something which was really rather extraordinary. There in the trunk of one of the very tall trees was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. "Oh, I wonder who lives here," thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw, there in front of him, another small, narrow door. But this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked on the door. "Who's there?" said a voice. A sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he was downright miserable. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, you are indeed," sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy. "Because I am," replied Mr. Miserable. "Would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Oh, I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable. "But I'm so miserable. I don't think I could ever be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made his mind up quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy, and he went out through the small, narrow, red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated, and then followed. Up and up the winding staircase they went, up and round and up and round and up until they came out into the wood. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable ever so slowly stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners. And, ever so slowly, it started turning up at the corners. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his whole life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And both of them laughed and laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable, who just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if ever you feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners. Go on. And that was Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Nosey by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Nosey liked to know everything about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddleton. The people of Tiddleton decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him.
We must find some way of stopping him being so nosy,
said Mr. Chips, the town carpenter.
That's right,
said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tiddleton laundry.
he needs to be taught a lesson. If only we could think of a way of stopping him poking his nose into everything,
said Mr. Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face.
Listen,
he said, now grinning.
I have a plan.
All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along Tiddleton High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and, tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peeped in. Splash! Went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint.
"Oh dear, I am sorry,"
said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and, standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. Snap! Went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose.
"Oh dear, I am sorry,"
said Mrs. Washer, who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street, feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and, creeping very quietly to the very end of the fence, he peeped around. Bang! Went a hammer right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose.
"Oh dear, I am sorry,"
said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor, sore red nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and he crept up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd, the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tiddleton to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that, Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddleton. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if ever you are tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you had better expect one thing. A sore nose. And that was Mr. Nosey by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Sneeze by Roger Hargreaves. This is Coldland, which is a country somewhere near the North Pole. The weather in Coldland is winter all the time. When it isn't snowing, it's freezing. And when it isn't freezing, it's snowing. So, you can imagine how cold it is. Because it's so cold in Coldland, everybody lives there is cold as well. You can tell if somebody comes from Coldland because everybody there has a red nose. And people in Coldland aren't the only ones with red noses. In Coldland, you can see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice. In Coldland, you can even see red-nosed elephants. And what you hear most of the time in Coldland is a noise that sounds like this. The sound of the sneeze is very common indeed in Coldland, which is not very surprising, is it? This is the story of Mr Sneeze, who lived in a small, snow-covered cottage in Shivertown, the capital of Coldland. Every morning Mr Sneeze woke up, sneezed, got up, sneezed, got dressed, sneezed, went downstairs, sneezed, ate his breakfast, sneezed, and went to work, still sneezing.
Oh, well, I don't like sneezing all the time,
he thought to himself every day, until one day he decided to leave Coldland and try to find a cure for the sneezes. So, that very same day, Mr Sneeze packed the things he'd need for his journey, mainly handkerchiefs, sneezed, locked his front door, sneezed, and set off. He walked and sneezed and walked his way across Coldland, and then he sneezed and walked and sneezed for days and days, until Coldland was far behind. As he walked away from Coldland, he noticed that there was less and less snow, and eventually he walked so far that there was no snow at all. And as he walked, he noticed something else. He wasn't walking and sneezing, he was walking and walking. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sneezing. Not at all. Not a bit. Not even the tiniest tissue.
Well, I wonder why I'm not sneezing,
he thought to himself. But he must have thought his thought out loud to himself, because a voice behind him replied,
"You're not sneezing because you haven't got a cold."
Mr Sneeze jumped, turned, and there behind him stood a wise old wizard.
What's a cold?"
asked Mr Sneeze.
"A cold is what you catch when you're too cold,"
said the wise old wizard, wisely.
Oh,
said Mr Sneeze.
But I come from a country called Coldland, where everybody is too cold all the time." "Nonsense," snorted the wizard. "It can't be too cold all the time because of the sun."
And he pointed to the sun, which was smiling in the sky.
"But we don't have any sun in Coldland," said Mr Sneeze. "No sun!" exclaimed the wizard. "How extremely, extraordinarily extraordinary! We'd better do something about that then, hadn't we?" Yes,"
agreed Mr Sneeze, not quite knowing what the wizard was talking about.
"And how far away is this place called Coldland?" asked the wizard. "Oh, it's miles and miles and miles away," replied Mr Sneeze. "In which direction?" asked the wizard.
Mr Sneeze pointed.
"Shouldn't take long,"
said the wizard, who then waved his wand and muttered some magic words, which wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. Whatever those magic words were, they worked. Before you could say sneeze, both the wizard and Mr Sneeze were transported to Shivertown, which, you will remember, is the capital of Coldland. As usual, It was snowing.
I say, this is a cold, gloomy place,
said the wizard.
Achoo!
Replied Mr. Sneeze, who had started sneezing again.
Cold land certainly needs some sunshine,
said the wizard.
And that's going to take some rather special magic.
Oh, please hurry up, said Mr. Sneeze, who was rapidly turning into a snowman.
Now,
said the wizard, ignoring him,
I'm going to say some magic words, and I want you to sneeze 3 times immediately afterwards.
The wise old wizard then held up his magic wand and muttered some more magic words, which again wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were.
Achoo! Achoo! Achoo!
Sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Then, quite suddenly, as if by magic, which indeed it was, the sun came out from behind the big black clouds, and it stopped snowing.
There now,
said the wizard,
that should stop the sneezing.
and then, after muttering some more magic words, and without waiting even to say goodbye, he disappeared. Mr. Sneeze just stood there in the sunshine, watching the snow begin to melt. After that, the sun shone every day, and today Coldland isn't anything like it used to be. You can't see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice anymore. And these days, the sound of the sneeze is a very uncommon sound indeed. And even Mr. Sneeze doesn't sneeze anymore. And that isn't the only thing different about Mr. Sneeze, as he discovered himself when he looked in the mirror one morning. Can you see what was different about Mr. Sneeze? It happened one other time too. See if you can find the page where that was. And that was Mr. Sneeze by Roger Hargreaves. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, be sure and like the video. And remember, you can always subscribe to the channel at Read Us a Story. Thanks!